Greetings, scholars. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the founding of Rome and look at the three major founding myths, how they work together, how they clash, and what is real. First, and probably the most famous one, is Romulus and Remus, the twins, rescued by the gods, suckled by a she-wolf to survive. They start as descendants of Aeneas, and you'll remember Aeneas from the Aeneid. He was the Trojan boy who escapes Troy as it falls at the end of the Iliad. More specifically, they're said to have been born of Rhea Silva, who is also sometimes called Ilia. And as we talked about when we talked about the Iliad, Ilium is the city of Troy. So her nickname was literally Troy. She was a Vestal virgin in some accounts, and in most accounts, their father was the god of war Mars himself. How these baby twins end up being cared for by a she-wolf, their evil uncle thinks that they're a threat, so he tries to have the babies killed, but the river god of the Tiber River saves them. A she-wolf suckles them in a cave until local shepherds find them and raise them as their own. As adults, their true identity is discovered. They bravely depose their evil uncle and restore their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa. Then they go off to found their own city, and even though the restoration of their grandfather tale includes Remus getting captured and a rescue mission being bravely undergone to save him, deep brotherly love ends up Romulus kills Remus while they're arguing about logistics and the map for the founding of their own city. You'll see in this, we've got Palatine Hill, which was favored by Romulus, and Aventine Hill, favored by Remus. The city of Rome consists of 7 hills around the Tiber River there. So in the end, they were both right, but Remus didn't live to see the founding, according to this myth. And as you can see, our time frame for this is around 753 BC. Founding number 2, or 1.5 maybe, is Virgil's Aeneid. Off the heels of those Greek epics about the Trojan War, you have Aeneas, who escapes Troy and goes on his own adventure. I have 2 maps here. One of them is Odysseus's many crisscrosses across the Mediterranean Sea on his way home to Ithaca after the end of the Trojan War. And the other one is Virgil's Aeneid, the crisscrossing adventures of Aeneas on his way to his destiny of founding a new civilization after the fall of Troy. Bridging the foundation of Rome into these Bronze Age Greek epics about the Trojan War create a ruling class who later founded Rome as direct descendants of the Trojans, legitimizing an older rule instead of being some upstart new guys in comparison to the Greeks, who the Romans adore and also eventually conquer. But by tying themselves into an ancient civilization as the legitimate heirs, it binds them to an older tradition and kind of lends some cultural gravity. I give you the year 1184 here. The Trojan War, taking about 10 years, is roughly calculated to probably ending in 1184-ish, depending on which historian you are working with. I also threw up there that Homer was writing the Iliad and the Odyssey around the time that Romulus and Remus were mythically founding Rome. And Aeneid is written by Virgil, as you can see, centuries later, in around 30 BC, while sitting in Rome. That has very much been a republic for 500 years at this point, backtracking a history. All right, number 3 is kind of what I learned in school. Latin shepherds founded Rome in 753 BC. It's the same date as Romulus and Remus mythically founding Rome in 753. And that is from scholars working a little bit before the time of Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, kind of backtracking from where they sat in that 1st or 2nd century BC in Rome, going through their history and counting backwards, basically, to try to figure out when. And so they create this sort of legendary day of April 21st, 753, as if the same calendar was in use during that time. It's to have a date in order to be able to have a founding holiday. I guess they picked one. But that mixing of fact and legend here, I think, is an important one to note here with Latin shepherds. Romulus and Remus were adopted by Latin shepherds and raised from the time they were babies with this previous lineage of Aeneas bringing the surviving Trojans to settle on what is now the Italian peninsula, and specifically founding the city of Alba Longa, which is where Romulus and Remus are born before they go out on their own to forge their own society. The Etruscans, this idea of, well, then who was there before that? We have the Etruscans, and that is a group that has their own culture, social customs, burial customs, artistic styles that we look at as part of this earliest understanding of Rome. They were pre-Rome, but at the same time, they were very much a part of this story. So this map has the Etruscans in their expansion to about 500 BC. You can see that the Etruscans had Rome. Right before that, in the 750s, the Etruscan and Latin tribal lands, Rome was about on the border between the two. So they're all working on that, I guess, southwest side of the Apennine mountain chain that runs all the way up the boot of Italy. You could say that they clashed. The earliest kings of Rome appear historically to have been Etruscan. Much of early Roman culture borrows heavily from the artistic styles of the Etruscans. So what makes the founding of Rome? Well, I've got a option extra bonus to help tie all three of these different but similar founding myths together. I give you Cincinnatus. He is a real historic figure that becomes somewhat legendary. And I picked this sculpture of George Washington as Cincinnatus that I think is a great analogy for us to understand how George Washington was a real person. And we are in a phase of history right now where we are being very critical of the men themselves in history, but we also still understand what George Washington stands for in our sort of founding mythology. Even if it's based on actual people and events, there's sort of this legendary status about some of it. So Cincinnatus, he stands for the ideal of the Roman Republic and what it means to be a good citizen and civil servant. He was from the Roman patrician ruling class, and patrician being that sort of aristocratic family is also where we get the word father. So the idea of being a good gentleman aristocrat meant that you were a public servant. You were fatherly and caretaking of your people. So Cincinnatus was a public servant serving as Rome's consul retired in 460, goes to his farm out in the countryside. And in 458, when there are border skirmishes and a potential invasion, they beg him to come lead the city. So he puts down his plow and he comes back to Rome and he takes over as absolute dictator. And he puts down the invasion, saves Rome, and then hands all of the power back to the elected officials and goes back to his farm and takes up his plow and becomes a private citizen again. And then when there's major issue, nearly 20 years later, they go knock on his farmyard door and ask him to do it all over again 20 years later, which he does. So this idea of being a public servant and also a gentleman farmer who isn't after absolute power, retires to be a quiet citizen in the countryside. And when he takes absolute power, it is only in service to Rome. So you'll note here that he is from the earliest days. He was born into that first decade of Rome as a republic. As I said before, there were the pre-Republican kings. And so he becomes this early exemplary figure in the Republic on what it means to be a citizen and civil servant. And he takes on this legendary status. So, was it Romulus and Remus? Were they really descendants of Aeneas? Does that matter? Was it Cincinnatus? Was it a cohort of Latin shepherds? Was it Etruscan kings? The answer is yes. Now, what do we do with that? You can kind of start with, well, who was there first? This guy, I think, is the easiest answer I have for you, in that we know people were living with complex social structures on what is now the Italian peninsula for at least 5,300 years. I give you Ötzi, the Iceman, the oldest ice mummy that we have in this region. He has well-made clothing, very nice tools that include raw materials that had to have been traded from far distances. He has very nice weapons that indicate specialized division of labor and a community-based social culture. Ötzi is also a murder mystery. He was shot in the back, but his very fancy bronze axe was not stolen. It was still with his body when we found him just a few decades ago. So it is a much more sophisticated crime than just see things, take things, which I think we often think early people were like. And we can say that at least 5,500 years ago, society had already built up a more complex culture than that. Scavenger. Interestingly, the Etruscans seem to have mixed ancestry from those migrating from what is modern-day Turkey, and modern-day Turkey was also known as ancient Troy. So maybe there was a shred of folk knowledge retained in what Virgil was telling, that the Latins came from around Central Asia, Anatolia, around 1000 BCE. Ötzi himself, 5,300 years ago, is a mix of European and Anatolian ethnicity. Anatolia, again, means Turkey, means Troy. So that was still even thousands of years before the Trojan War. The myth of what Rome is almost more important than the archaeological reality. I know, for me to say that, because it tells us the cultural lineage and legitimacy it has, or at least that it aspired to as it built its legacy. Rome wanted roots deeper than Greece. Rome wanted heroes in their earlier, wilder days to be demigod sons of the god of war. And then Rome builds the greatest war machine history ever knew. It makes sense if the god Mars was literally their father. Yet it also prided itself on its republic that stood for 500 years, give or take a decade. And that needs heroes like Cincinnatus. And whether the facts match up or not, or some overlap, it's important that all of these founding myths work to show us what Rome maybe wasn't, but what it wanted to be.